Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Redacted, the show where I take a look at records that have a solid foundation, but a spotty execution, making a smoother listening experience out of it all. This month's honestly kind of been a wild card month for me. While I have a lot of bigger plans sitting in the background for stuff I want to do with this show, and I do have a sort of running theme going on, which is what this was originally going to be, but instead, I'm going to be putting that on the back burner once again, and it'll eventually see the light of day. It's a classic album, a classic double album, that I think will be a fun episode to do. I just want to let it cook a little longer. Instead, I'm going to be doing one that I wasn't even on my radar to do until very recently, when to celebrate this album's 13th year anniversary of all anniversaries, to drop a deluxe edition with some bonus tracks, along with releasing it on vinyl, something that I'm now actively on the hunt for, because even though it was on the bottom of my rankings of their discography, it is still a hell of a debut for one of my modern favorite bands, and I think that it still has a lot of great tracks in it, and some decent sequencing ideas. It's just definitely a foundation that they've made better. So I wanted to take a look at it, see if I could change some things around a bit and make it a better experience with some other bonus tracks they wrote throughout that era. I'm talking about the 2010 debut from one Everything Everything, Man Alive. Now, in spite of it being on the bottom of my ranking, I don't think it is a bad album by any stretch of the imagination. I think that Everything Everything still started with a hell of a foot forward with Man Alive. It has a lot of really good songs. It has some fun vignettes sonically, that some of which they do experiment with further and flourish out, and some do fall to the wayside, act as at least some interesting insights into where the band wanted to experiment sonically. It's got this lyrical through line and sort of lyrical themes brought up that they do explore even to this day on more recent outings. It is, for all intents and purposes, one of the best foot forwards for this band to make. And it wasn't even on my radar to do a Redacted on. But because a deluxe edition dropped now of all times with a handful of bonus tracks, it gave me the idea to sort of look at this album's track listing and that sort of Redacted mindset. Because there are at least a couple of instances where I feel like the sequencing gets a little weird. Also, there is at least a track that, while interesting sonically and lyrically, I could do without. And so my goal with redacting it was to sort of look at the track listing, rearrange it in some regards, swapping at least the one song I did swap out, while including a couple of the bonus tracks for a few select reasons to sort of help further pay tribute to this band's first foot forward. I ended up with one track more on here, 15 tracks with 54 minutes of runtime, so a couple of minutes longer, but I think that the sequencing at hand kind of makes that runtime feel all the breezier. With that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the track listing before talking about why I laid the tracks in the order that I did. I don't wanna know what happened to your boyfriend, 'cause he was looking at me like, whoa, here I you see me on the picture log, but I never left over the picture, but boys say you did it, and all the girls, my eyes are wide and my teeth dropping straight out of my skull. Sure, you'll make a decent father. There's a World War coming in all this season. I wish the summer was over us and done. Did you polish our red set? Ready for reincarnation? Gotta come back to something organic. Oh, you lost the kids with your blood. So release your medicine, morning, rest of the band. Chasing homeless cheerleaders through the dash codes. Take a seat, full of suffragette, suffragette. I wanna be airborne and they won't know through the awkward wall. It seems the rain dance went out after the all but your heaviest of moments all together now. It's one of the things I I've always praised this band for whenever talking about them is the fact that they know how to get an album rolling. And on their debut, that is no exception. I kept the first 4 tracks in their original placement in this version. My Keys Your BF through Leave the Engine Room is a good practice. It's a good showcase and sequencing of a great 3-track run of kinetic energy, showcasing some well-nuanced bombast, some fun metaphorical and snarky lyric play, and having some subject matter that again acts as a good introduction to ideas that the band further explores both on here and elsewhere in their discography. With My Keys Your Boyfriend having these nice, fun 2 different types of synths weaving around, the lean guitar play and fun rhythm play, while having this sort of fun call and response style writing being a sort of snark look at vapid self-indulgence through the lens of like treating your life like it's a sitcom, complete with audience reactions from Jonathan Higgs at dramatic lines written talking about relationships and the sort of very ahead of its time going all in the social driven aspect that sort of society was heading towards in the early stages of social media. I think that it's a track that is really well written and is a really good starting point for this album as a whole that goes fantastically into QWERTY Finger with its kinetic ass percussion with the hand claps and drum play that plays with syncopation with a great lead riff on top of that and lyrics that sort of, again, similarly to other tracks that they've explored even to this day, talking about the dangers of going all in on technology and the downfall that can bring in a nicely written manner. I love the vocal run throughout the verses of it. It's similar to other tracks on the track listing. And it's just a nice sort of rager to carry the energy with a little more intensity before mellowing out a bit more while keeping in a nice groovy realm with Schoolin, a track that has this, again, sort of quirky style of writing, having this synth line that loops throughout the verses, acting as sort of a punchline to some of Jonathan Higgs' lines, while having this sort of leaner drum groove carrying it all. And the bass play on here is really fun as well. It shows some fun chemistry between the drum and the bass that I think shines really brightly. That acts as a nice little sort of instrumental density lowering before lowering the groove even farther with Leave the Engine Room, a sort of minimal synth-driven song that throws the atmosphere in sort of a slightly different realm, leaning more into the synthetics played with on Schoolin, while having much more serious subject matter. Well, Schoolin was sort of talking about the metaphor of life being like a school and sort of always going through the struggles of life in a little, not necessarily as serious of a sense, given the word is Schoolin. Leave the Engine Room is about white guilt and sort of talks about the sins of the father and sort of the living with that. And I think that it tackles the subject matter well. You know, I think that the groove is an interesting place to take the soundscape, but I think that as far as keeping the energy minimal and introducing this more minimally driven aspect, I think that it does so well, and I sort of utilize that to keep things in a minimal and somewhat more bleak realm, because from there I go to the sort of 2-piece minimally driven, but also 3-piece lyrical journey of sorts with Tin the Manhole, 2 for Nero, and Final Form, which Tin the Manhole comes up in the track listing. It's a track that it comes later on, but I feel like following the minimal but still kind of percussive energy of that to ramp up the energy and more while keeping that minimalism creates this fun sort of flow for the record. And lyrically, it sort of gives the listener a sort of view into the album art, because it's about a red fox living in a machine-filled human world, talking about the parallels of nature versus man, and the sort of struggles that nature continues to grow to have the more that man pillages across the land with machinery. It's got a really nice sort of lower key synth that sort of feels sort of Radiohead adjacent, and I love the band playing with this energy even early on and doing their own with it. I also think that its pivot from the synthetic sort of core into the grand swells of the strings and choirs that come in, sort of act as a good instrumental pivot that I carry into Two for Nero. That lyrically sort of acts as the other side of the coin to Tin, because not only is nature fighting machines of man, man is now fighting machines of man, and using nostalgia as its breakaway from the bleakness that is the world on fire. It has this sort of diary-style writing that I think helps put the listener within the world that the band is sort of scoping in pockets of this album. It's also a point to sort of divert sonically in a way that the band, I'd say, fits very much the band's MO, but they don't quite do like this from here, by having this harpsichord-driven jam with mostly harpsichord and Jonathan Higgs carrying the song for at least the first half of it. The drums, when they do come in, still kind of sit low and more sort of add a little more to the groove, but it's minimal at its core, and I think that as far as the band, even this early on, trying to experiment with minimalism and song composition, this isn't a bad track. I think that it's very charming and very early 2010s, and I don't mind it. But the sort of period to both sides of this coin, or the impact moment, comes in final form. A track that in the original track listing acts as sort of a ramp up in energy, and I use it for that purposes here as well. When that lead riff comes in on the original, it's just such a smooth moment that I wanted to still retain in my Redacted. But it's a track about the decomposition of man, both physically and metaphorically, throughout the eyes of laziness, and again, just sort of hammering home those bleaker mindsets and ideas the band is writing with into a nice, firm, more energetic point following Two for Nero. Also to sort of ramp up the energy, because from there I keep the track listing sort of where it was, or how it was originally, with Photoshop Handsome coming after that, and because I love how that track comes in. While Final Form sort of ramps up the energy, it doesn't quite ramp up the bombast that much, and the sort of swell intro of Photoshop Handsome into those sharp synths and sort of militant snare drums lends to a great effect sequencing-wise. And the song itself is a banger. Obviously, Photoshop Handsome sort of in a more direct way of, you know, how shitty it is that Photoshopping, you know, affects body image and all that sort of stuff. But it sort of also extends it past just that and talks about sort of the Photoshop idea of creating a digital view of the world at large, and sort of expands out past that direct parallel pretty well, in my opinion, while also having some moments that, again, feel very early 2010s. Like, I love the bridge of this song, the various vocal stings that crop up in the a cappella style. I love it. It's so dramatic and snarky, and fits the vibe of the song tenfold, but it is also very early 2010s. All in all, it's just a moment to keep things energetic from Final Form while increasing that bombast that carries into its follow-up, Luddities and Lambs, one of the bonus tracks that I kept. Now, and I wish I could do on here something that I've talked about wanting to do on other Redacteds, like the Lady Gaga, the Fame one, and the Foo Fighters self-titled, where I wish I could sort of chop the last played note on Photoshop Handsome and have it play immediately into the drum fill of Luddities and Lambs, a track that further explores that sort of snarkness at technology and the technological age, while also being a place where the band not only gets their namesake from, but is the first song the band ever wrote. And I feel like, as far as telling the story of the band on their first album, this is kind of an important song to put in the track listing. It's also a nice album cut-ass song that I think fits really well in a later part of the album. It's got a fun lead riff, it's got some great bass production in its verses, and I like it. I like it a lot. I think it's a great place to take the energy post-Photoshop Handsome, which I also think sort of bookends this 3-track run of more kineticism really well, because from there, I slow it down abruptly with NASA on Your Side. Similarly to Big Game, it sort of has this tonal approach to it that feels very ramp up to the end. And lyrically, it feels like that too. It feels purposefully constructed this way. And I think that it's a really good track that has a good swerve after its initial soft introduction. I love the drum and bass play on here as well, and I think that it is a nice little groove that Jonathan Higgs dances with so very well. Similarly to some of the tracks on here, it talks about the end of man, talks about the finality of man in a much more intimate sense. And again, as far as like keeping elements of the original in check here, I just wanted to have this be a sort of near the end of the album cut to sort of take the energy and ramp it down a little bit before going into one last single from this album that keeps it more intimate and personal, you know, while we're dealing with these grand apocalyptic ideas throughout a lot of this. I wanted to sort of rein it in at one point on here with Suffragette Suffragette, a sharply written breakup song that has a great refrain in it. It has this real snark to it that they've tapped in at other parts on here, but I like the personal twist that this track adds while being a point where the energy ramps up, but not necessarily the bombast all that much, which from there pivots into the actual last couple moments on the album with the penultimate track, Hiawatha Doomed, a track that similarly to other parts of the record just have these moments that make it feel like they fit in a piece of the record, and having this intro of "But in the end, we bend but easily break" comes in really well in the ends of Suffragette Suffragette, and the song itself keeps the energy in place, amping it up ever so slightly. There's a little more bombast throughout this, and it grounds some of those more bleak observances at the end that tracks like NASA on Our Side dulled with, but put it more at the forefront to put the listener in the now in a sort of sense that while looking back on the end, it is finally here, it's almost here, you're almost at the end. It also has some of those nature-man parallels in some of the writing that the album toys with. I don't know, it just feels like a track that should have ended up on the album, so I included it here. But I don't make it the closer, because while in the end we bend but easily break, it's the Waits that come crashing down to end it all. Waits is a track that was the original closer. They purposefully made it the end of Man Alive, and I think that it's a really good closer. That, like other tracks on the record that have this evolution across this track listing with an increase in density, it does so to the nth degree. It has this track that feels written to be a show-stopping closer, so why not make it so? I love the layering that has on this track. I love the groove. I love the drums and the bass. I love the weird synth ideas that crop up on here. It just has this written about weight that is sonically displayed well. And I feel like if I'm going to be closing a project like this, that's the best way to do it. And that's my version of Man Alive. Would you like to spin it? Did you like it? It's linked in the description, both at a Spotify and YouTube link. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lots of situations. And I'll see you another day.